Hello, Gaku here. Lately, I've been very busy driving for Uber. So busy, in fact, that I hadn't gotten around to making part 2 of this video. And I've been riding that gravy train for as long as it'll take me. But as I've seen, the employee versus contractor issue is something that's once again coming up in the news. And it's something that the Biden administration seems to want to push through on behalf of those who favor employment for gig economy workers. Now, I still am not in favor of this, and I know my opinion on it isn't going to matter one bit because whatever is going to happen is going to happen, but I'm going to go ahead and make this video to explain my position on it. Now, I've continued my little personal experiment, which is as I drive people around and as we talk about whatever my passengers want to talk about, if I discover that my passenger is an Uber driver or a Lyft driver, or even if they just happen to be a delivery driver in the gig economy, like DoorDash, GoPuff, that sort of thing, I always ask them without priming whether they've heard about the debate as to whether gig economy workers should be employees or contractors, and then I ask them their opinion and ask them why. On one side, I have many dozens of people who prefer being a contractor. This isn't limited to just those who work part-time. And on the other side, I have 2 people who say they prefer being an employee. Now, it's interesting to contrast that in many of these rides, the person that I happen to be asking, that gig economy worker, wasn't necessarily the only rider. It's interesting that a lot of the other riders who were not Uber or Lyft drivers, who were not delivery drivers, who maybe have never worked in their lives, but they definitely were not gig economy workers, these people were happy to chime in before the person had even answered that Uber and Lyft drivers should be employees. So that's really interesting when you think about it. So the person who doesn't have direct experience oftentimes has an opinion that's different from their friend who does in fact have experience in this economy. Now, before we get to my specific reasons for preferring to be a contractor and my predictions on what's going to happen if and when drivers are reclassified as employees, I want to talk about the 5 different groups that have a vested interest in the outcome, whatever it happens to be. The first is passengers. Passengers first and foremost want a quick and cheap ride, and all other considerations are secondary. Many passengers have both Uber and Lyft on their phones. If they're looking for a quick ride first and foremost, then they're going to open both apps, request a ride on both of them, and take the ride that gets there first, canceling the other one. If they want a cheap ride, then at least in my area, they're going to get on Lyft first, and when they get fed up of waiting for a driver that never arrives, then they're going to get on Uber and pay an extra 50 cents and be annoyed at it. After they're done with the trip, they're not going to tip because, of course, they care about the cheap ride, and to the average passenger, the Uber driver is just a glorified bus driver. And of course, you don't tip the bus driver. Now, if you ask any of these people who use these services if, let's say, a driver should be making more money, in an abstract sense, they will absolutely say yes, and they might even be people who support the $15 minimum wage. But if this means their ride is going to be $1 more expensive, you can bet your ass they're going to argue against it. Not only that, they might choose to use a different service altogether if there's a better or cheaper alternative. The point here is that passengers are fickle. Brand loyalty is not a thing. They're going to take whichever happens to be the most convenient. And it just so happens that Uber and Lyft are way more convenient than a taxi, because who's going to wait an hour for a cab that's going to cost twice as much as an Uber or Lyft? Very few people. But keeping passengers relatively happy is important if this service is going to continue operating in any meaningful way. Now, the next group I want to consider are cab drivers. Cab drivers for many decades had an incredible monopoly. And if you've ever considered the price of the taxi licenses and how just ridiculously expensive they are, that's the reason. It's essentially a futures market, and that bubble thankfully has burst. Back in the good old days, from the cab perspective, they would get an unsuspecting rider, turn on the meter, and gouge the shit out of them. And if your locality is anything like here locally, then they might have special rules on your pickups and drop-offs that would just add extra fees on top. For example, in my city, there are areas that are definitely in town, but technically outside the city limits. And if you happen to be an unlucky individual in one of these areas, they could tack on an extra $100 fee just for showing up at off hours. Ridiculous wait times, stupid expensive, and unless you're in a massive city where you could just throw your hand up and hail a cab, very inconvenient. When you call a cab, if you get a ride within an hour, consider yourself lucky. And then after that, you get gouged, and you get to thank the driver for the privilege, and they want a tip. Now, I've been driving for Uber for about 4 years, and in that time, I've had many passengers who happen to be their first time riding Uber, And usually it was because a cab had just stood them up and they wanted to just try it out, try out a different mode of transportation. And then after taking their first Uber, I'm fairly certain they never went back. Passengers in general hate cabs, and once they've taken an Uber or two, they generally never go back. Why would you pay more than twice as much for a less convenient service? Now, from the cab driver perspective, since Uber and Lyft came around, their fantastic monopoly has just imploded. Many cab drivers decided, well, if you can't beat them, join them, and either became Lyft and Uber drivers, or depending on your location, might do Uber taxi. But for the rest of them, you got some very pissed off drivers with a vested interest in Uber and Lyft failing by whatever means. This means that if something hurts Uber, the company, the cab drivers are going to be in favor of it. If something hurts Uber drivers, cab drivers are going to be in favor of it. This also includes those who might happen to advocate on behalf of cab drivers, unions, that sort of thing. If they can lobby a city to shut down Uber and Lyft entirely, believe me, they're going to do everything they can to do it. And if a cab driver thinks that Uber drivers being classified as employees is going to either hurt Uber drivers or Uber itself, they're going to push for it. Next, we have to consider Uber Corporate. Uber for many years has been a loss leader. That is, they've been subsidizing rides and losing money in order to gain market share and loyal customers, with mixed results. So again, passengers are fickle, but at least those passengers, even if they do happen to use Lyft, are probably going to have Uber on their phone, and vice versa. But a company can only operate at a loss for so long. Something's got to give. The OG Uber drivers got to experience this firsthand, and unfortunately, bore the brunt of it. When I started driving 4 years ago, this was probably the absolute worst time to start driving, but for various reasons I did it anyway, and things have only improved since then. Depending on when you started driving, you might have a different take on the Uber experience. For example, if you were one of the very well-paid Uber drivers early on, so well paid that you tricked out your car and took out a massive loan, maybe got a luxury vehicle to drive for Uber Black, you're giving out free bottled water to everyone, mints, candies, whatnot. It's just a party in your car. And then your rates get cut, and all of a sudden, you can't afford it. You might have seen that famous video of the Uber Black driver who got into an argument with the Uber CEO, Kalanick, I believe. The driver tells Kalanick, how could you do this to me? You cut my rates. I just took out a loan and bought this brand new vehicle, and now I can't make enough to pay for it. And Kalanick tells the guy, well, that's your own fault. Sad as it is to say, Kalanick is right. As a gig economy worker, there are no guarantees. And during that race to the bottom, a lot of drivers who had gotten used to whatever they were getting paid, I'm sure they decided to duck out and go do other things. Now, when I started driving, it was at that transition period where I like to call it the bad old days. But during that time, I had people who got in my car, and most people at that time were not familiar with Uber, but some knew Uber from whatever big city they happened to come from. And they would tell me, hey, by the way, you should have some bottled water to give out, and you should have some candies and stuff. And I'd tell them, well, you know, if Uber wants to give me some bottled water to hand out, I'll hand it to you, but otherwise I'm not buying it, you know. Tax deductible is not the same as free. And, you know, for your $2.50 ride, I'm not going to spend 50 cents on a bottle of water to hand you for free and just hope for a tip. Back in the bad old days, Uber actually promoted the idea that the Uber fare includes the tip. And drivers were instructed to actively refuse tips back then. And I'm sure some of them might have been stupid enough to do that. But, you know, if anyone wanted to hand me a couple of bucks, I certainly would take it. But, you know, it was rare because the marketing was so good. Uber's cheaper than a cab, and not only is it cheaper, but you also don't have to tip. And this also gets to why a lot of passengers might today still consider Ubers to be glorified bus service. Anyway, beyond that, Uber, for many years, has been losing money. And they've been losing money to undercut the cabs as well as to try and undercut Lyft. But it's been this race to the bottom that peaked about 4 years ago. And at that point, the turnover in drivers was so incredibly high that they had to start increasing rates to compensate the drivers better because people simply weren't willing to stick around and drive for peanuts. Of course, since that time, tipping has also been integrated into the Uber app. That's changed from the top down, but this was like an actual fight that had to take place. New York drivers fighting for the right to put tip jars in their car, that was a big thing back then. Now, personally, I thought it was tacky, but, you know, it's understandable why they would want to do that. I'm going to make a third video to discuss the trajectory of Uber and maybe talk more about the history, but especially Uber in its current state. But the main thing here I want to talk about is that Uber, the company, has goals which don't necessarily coincide with the other different groups that we're talking about. So Uber's primary goal is to make money, and they haven't been making money, which means they have to turn things around pretty quick. Now, how is Uber going to make a profit? Well, either they can increase the gross income by charging passengers more for fares, which is something they've started doing lately, or they can look for ways to cut costs. And we saw some years ago the effects of cutting the costs, which is drivers leave. As it is right now, there's a massive driver shortage, so this really isn't an option. If anything, if they want more drivers to come out, they need to increase incentives, which they have been doing, and this has come at the expense of the passengers. So previously, they were throwing the drivers under the bus to appease the passengers, but now it's the other way around. Passengers are not happy. They've gotten accustomed to their low fares, and these high fares that they're experiencing now, whether they are appropriate or not, are simply different from what they're used to, and they are not happy about this one bit. The fourth group I'm going to talk about are what I'm going to call activists, because unlike passengers, the activists are the ones that are pushing for changes, generally in favor of employment status. Some of the activists might be drivers, but many of them just might be politicians or vocal socialists, for example. So what does the activist want? If I were to be charitable, I would say they have good intentions, but I think unforeseen consequences undermine most of what they're pushing for. When a Democrat legislator is in favor of pushing for employment status, it sounds good on paper. I'm sure they mean well, but I don't think they've fully considered the implications of what they're pushing for. And I think this applies to most activists, the same as those people I talked about earlier who are passengers who happen to chime in on behalf of their friend who is a gig economy worker, maybe pushing for something that that worker themselves did not want. And finally, we have to consider Uber drivers themselves. For whatever you might imagine the situation to be, Uber drivers exist in isolation. This is really to be expected. Consider if there is one passenger and two drivers, one of those drivers is going to get the ride and drive it. The other one is not. There is competition between drivers. The best thing possible from an individual Uber driver's perspective is for all other drivers to be off the road. For all the recruitment drives that Uber is pushing, but realize that for every driver that signs up, that's less money in your pocket long term, so I'm not recruiting anyone. Even when it comes to the current COVID-related PPP unemployment status of certain drivers, that's the main reason for the driver shortage right now. Basically, during wave one of the stimulus, everyone got rejected outright. I didn't apply, but I read the stories. They were talking about people in places like, say, Orlando. No one was going to Disney, so all the Uber drivers there lost 75% of their income. So they all tried to get on unemployment, and then they got rejected outright. Well, that news story went away, but turns out in wave two, they all got approved. So right now, there are a ton of drivers around the country sitting at home collecting checks. And although this indirectly helps drivers by ensuring there are fewer drivers on the road, it also undermines the status of current drivers by undermining the economy itself. Put another way, there's very little camaraderie between drivers. If you're getting paid, that means someone else is not. Or if someone else is getting paid, that means that you're not getting paid. It's actually worse than a zero-sum game because the whole is less than the sum of its parts. When it comes to surges and this sort of thing, other drivers actively inhibit your ability to make a living and vice versa. It's no wonder then that drivers don't typically work together in any meaningful way, although there are instances where individual actions can benefit all drivers uniformly. Now, before we continue and look at what I believe are the expected and likely outcomes of changing Uber drivers to employees, let's talk a little bit about unintended consequences. You might remember back when Obamacare first passed, I believe the rule was if a company had, I think it was 50 employees, they had to provide certain benefits, and I think there was a separate limit, a separate set of restrictions for companies with over 250. If you had a mid-sized or large company, and especially the large national chains, if you had over some number of employees, then you as a company were obligated to provide health care for your employees. So what happened overnight? Well, suddenly the vast majority of Americans found they were no longer full-time workers. So if you were working 40 hours a week, you suddenly lost 1 hour. And even though you're working essentially just as much and just as hard, and maybe even having to stay and work hours that you weren't being credited for, you are now a part-time worker. So not only are you working less hours and getting paid less, but you're also not getting the very benefits that you were supposed to get according to the legislation. And as we saw in many cases, Walmart especially, rather than taking the current employees and giving them the extra benefits, it's cheaper just to cut the hours of everyone you already have and then employ more part-time workers to pick up the slack. So not exactly a great situation, but for those activists and people who were pushing for Obamacare back at the time, and it was like, who could have possibly foreseen this? It's like literally everyone said this was going to happen, and it did. It's like the logical outcome. And really what you have to do is put yourself in the shoes of, say, Walmart, and just assume you're going to be the most dickish corporation possible. You're going to do everything possible to save as much money as possible. Damn the consequences. What are you going to do? Well, in this case, you're going to throw your employees under the bus, and that's exactly what they did. Let's look at another unintended consequences we've seen over and over, which is minimum wage. And as you are probably aware, minimum wage increases tend to hurt smaller companies. But really what ends up happening is that people get laid off. If you're forced to pay people more than their work is really worth, it is not viable to have that employee around anymore. And this is why we see kiosks and automation springing up everywhere. It's why you have touch screens to order your food at places like McDonald's. It's why when you go to Walmart, there are 24 empty registers and one do-it-yourself check-through line with one person overseeing it. It's because in the past, maybe it made sense to have people working all those other lanes, but through what they call scientific management, they figured out what is the absolute minimum number of people they can have working the registers to still get people through in a relatively timely manner where they're not too pissed off. So no one likes it, but maybe they won't be pissed off enough to not come back next time. Finally, let's look at some possible scenarios when it comes to Uber drivers being classified as employees. First, let's look at the fairy tale scenario. The fairy tale scenario is that everything remains exactly the same as it is now. Passengers pay the same rates, which many of them already consider to be way too high. The drivers get paid at the exact same rates. The mileage rate is the same. The surges are the same. The promotions are the same. Everything is the same, except on top of that, the drivers are also getting health care, days off, minimum wage, etc., etc., etc. In this case, nothing has changed except the expenses to Uber have skyrocketed. This is not going to be sustainable, and it's not going to happen in a million years. Something's got to give. Uber has been a loss leader up to this point, but there's a limit to how far you can go with that. At some point, a company has to make a profit if it's going to remain solvent. And this is the point where the socialists would say, well, just take the money from the evil capitalists, or, cut the executive pay and whatnot. Unfortunately for those people, we don't live in a socialist system, so that's not really a viable option either. Regardless of how much you might want to do it, the company itself is not going to allow it. And remember, just as we looked at Walmart, put yourself in the shoes of Uber and assume your number one goal at this point is to make money, and how are you going to do it? By whatever means necessary. If that means throwing different people under the bus, you're going to do that. And it's just a question of who's getting thrown under the bus and by how much. And unfortunately, as a driver, I am almost 100% sure it's going to be the drivers that are going to be worse off for it. But let's look at what's actually likely to happen. The first realistic possibility, I'm going to call the California freelance rider outcome. Maybe you've heard of this or maybe you haven't, but there was a push in California to have professional riders classified as employees. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? But the idea was that if you were a regular columnist for a publication of some sort, then at some point you go from being a freelance writer to an employee of that company. And if you're an employee, of course, they said you need health care and all the other benefits of being an employee. So what happened in California? Suddenly everyone got restricted on how many articles they could submit. So overnight, everyone became freelance. And suddenly it's a situation, be careful what you wish for, because you might just get it. And they got it. That is, anyone who wrote more than X number of articles for publication became an employee, which meant that everyone got restricted to being just shy of that number, so no one got to be an employee. Congratulations. So the first situation is what I'm calling the nightmare scenario, which is that Uber does the exact same logical thing that happened to all of the now freelance riders out in California. The very thing that they were all warned was going to happen, which actually did happen. which is Uber is going to cut the hours or the allowed hours of anyone who drives, which is if the legislation said that anyone who drives more than 35 hours is an employee, then you can be sure they're going to cut your app off at 34.9 hours. At that point, you won't be able to accept any more trips, and I hope you got enough to last you the week, because that's all you're going to be driving. Now, for me, that would be a disaster, because when I drive, I often drive well over 40 hours. Sometimes I drive up to 60 hours a week, and that's my choice. But as I do that, I plan for that, and I get shit done. But if you restrict me, now we've got some real problems. So that's the first possibility, which is just across the board, they cut everyone to part-time. And if you drive less than 35 hours, then maybe you're fine with that, because that means there's less competition for you. And as I've said, all Uber drivers operate in isolation and compete with each other. So there are scenarios where you might want this to happen. For me, it would be a disaster, because my pay would instantly be cut by at least a third. But if you're someone who drives less than 35 hours, then you don't care. And actually, this would benefit you, because then I'm driving less, which means more rides for you. So as a greedy bastard, I could see why you would want that. But as I'm a greedy bastard, I don't want that, because I want those hours. So again, this gets to where Uber drivers compete with each other. Now, this is also a nightmare for Uber in its current state, because as it is, they already have a driver shortage. So if they're further restricting the hours that existing drivers can ride, you can see that's a very big problem for them, which means they either have to shell out more money or they have to increase rates. If they increase the rates, they piss off the passengers. If they increase the pay, then the company becomes less viable as a business. And obviously what they would like to do is to cut the pay, but at some point that's no longer possible. So again, this is the nightmare scenario as far as I'm concerned, which is that Uber goes the way of Walmart and basically restricts everyone's hours. So that, unfortunately, is the most likely outcome. But let's look at sort of an intermediate outcome, which is possible, but I don't think likely, is that they have different classes of drivers, some which are considered employees and some which aren't. Now, you might be aware of the driver's status. I think it's like blue, gold, platinum, and diamond, something like that. I've been at diamond ever since the program started, so I don't really know what the lower ones are, but I'm like 3 times over diamond, so it's like I'm way up there. But you might imagine a situation where people who are diamond or better are employees, and people who are below diamond are not. But this creates some problems. So at the lower end, we have all the people who are not considered employees. And for them, you have the same situation as we have for the riders in California, which is they'll be able to come out and drive for X number of hours a week, maybe 20, maybe 30, whatever the limit happens to be. When they hit that limit, they're done, their app turns off, and they have to wait till next week to continue doing any rides. Now, that's a real problem if, let's say, at the end of your week on a Saturday or something, it's really busy and you want to go out there and there's a ton of rides. Oh, you can't. I'm sorry, you've hit your limit, which might piss off some of the part-timers, but I guess if you plan ahead, you can still work around it. Now let's look at the employees. And this is very similar to the Walmart example, which is Uber is going to want to have the absolute minimum number of employees possible, and then make up all of the slack with as many part-timers who receive no benefits as possible. So those employee slots are going to be highly competitive, and keeping it a slot is going to be a bit of a problem for drivers. If you pretend you're the evil company trying to make money by any means possible, then the absolute last thing you're going to want to do is pay your employees overtime. So what's the logical conclusion here? It's that Uber, instead of allowing its drivers to get on whenever they like, anyone who's an employee is now going to have a set schedule. You're going to have your time block, and you damn well better be on. You're going to have your 40 hours a week and not a minute more, because that would be overtime, and that's going to cost Uber more money. So Uber's going to get a ton of part-timers to fill in the gaps. And then if you are fortunate or unfortunate enough to be an employee, as the case may be, then you are, well, you're now a 9-to-5 worker, essentially. It's just whatever shift you happen to get. If Uber is going to have any employees, the circumstances of employment are going to be very different from the way Uber driving has been up to this point. Now, I've already stated a lot of my opinions on why I prefer being a contractor, but I want to just pull it all together as a driver to tell you specifically why I prefer being a contractor and my concerns given the likely outcomes of a change. So the past 4 months I've been working essentially nonstop. And the reason why initially was because I thought I would have to take a lot of time off at some point to help family. But that's been delayed and eventually delayed indefinitely. But as I've been planning for that, I've just been working my ass off. Very few days off, and I've just been stacking Benjamins. I've made enough in the past 4 months to pay for the entire year, and I've invested more in the past 4 months than I've invested in the last 20 years. Now that might be a function of me just working really hard. It also might be a function of the economy falling apart, but somewhere in between there. I'm basically doing just fine as a driver, and I don't need anyone's help, especially not from people trying to look out for my best interests on my behalf. Okay, so that's first. As it is right now, I can work as many hours as I want, up to roughly 18 a day technically, but if you kind of game it. But I don't need that many. I work 6 is my off days and 10 is like my regular days, sort of in between there. I can work comfortably 8 hours a day every day. I can work more if I need to, and if I have an off day or if I want to sleep in or something, then I'll work 6. So that's fine for me. Now, if you come to me and you say, if you present me an option, a choice between what I've been doing, which is working as many hours as I want to, versus, let's say the best case scenario is that I become an employee, but I'm capped at 40 hours. Okay, so that's a problem right there, is I'm losing, let's say, 25% of my income minimum, okay? So it's like, hey, you get all these benefits. Okay, well, we'll talk about the benefits later, but let's just look at the base pay for your time, and I'm already losing money, okay? Now, let's look at the worst case scenario, which is that Uber decides to make everyone part-time, which means now I'm losing maybe 40% of my income. So yeah, I'm working way less, but I can't possibly make more. So this is the nightmare scenario, as I mentioned. Now, as I also said, all drivers are independent and they compete with each other. So it might be that although this hurts me a lot, it might be good for you. So maybe you don't care. Maybe you only drive 20 hours a week, and if I'm driving less, that means more rides for you. So not good for me, but I can understand where you're coming from. So that might actually be a good option for some people. Now, for me, as a professional driver, and ostensibly the sort of person that this legislation is supposed to help, it's very bad. Okay, now that's the first thing. It's just the base pay cut. Regardless of what happens, I'm going to be making less, because we've considered Uber the evil corporation, if you want to consider it that way. What are they going to do? Are they going to increase rates for the passengers? Well, they've already done that, and passengers are pissed off. And if the rates keep going up, then there is a limit at which passengers are going to stop riding Uber. They've already got other options. They've got lifts. They've got the little scooters, which if they want to, they can ride those. There are other little trolleys that people can take, at least here. And of course, there are cabs. If Ubers become way too expensive, people will go back to riding in cabs, as annoying as they might be. So that's the first thing. Now, second, one of the primary reasons that people give me for preferring to be a contractor is the ability to set your own hours. And I believe that this is the number one benefit to being a contractor and not an employee. I like to get on whenever I feel like. Sometimes it's 9 p.m., sometimes it's midnight, sometimes it's 2 a.m., sometimes it's 6 in the afternoon. But it's whenever I feel like. That's when I start driving, and then I drive until I feel like stopping. And it's not that I go until a set time. It's I go until either the traffic conditions make it such that I don't feel like driving anymore, or until I get tired, or some combination. So again, this is like the number one thing about being a driver. And if you want to take a day off, you can take a day off. You don't have to ask anyone for permission. You just simply don't drive. And the flip side of that is that Uber provides incentives for people to get out and drive at times where they might otherwise not drive. This is why the rates tend to be higher when everyone's out at the bars and clubs, because if the rates weren't higher, then the people who are currently driving you might themselves be out at the bars and clubs. Anyway, if you remove the ability for drivers to get on and off whenever they feel like, you have now removed the number one benefit to being an Uber driver. The whole reason the gig economy works is make money on the side whenever you feel like, as much or as little as you like, at any time that you like. Well, that goes out the window. So if you tell me that I have to be up at a certain time, I must be logged into the app at a certain time, and if I'm a minute late, I get written up, and if I don't accept trips at the right time, I get written up, and I must be on for X number of hours, or else at that point I walk and go do something else. And I'm sure there are some people who would be happy to put up with that, but this is one of the main benefits of not being a 9-to-5 worker. So if you're not taking that away, then maybe it's best to go do something else. Now, it might be that you prefer a highly structured schedule. I'm not one of those people. So again, where you fall on this will depend on that primarily. But I don't want to be restricted. I want to be able to work. If I want to work 12 hours one day and 4 the next, I want to be able to do that, rather than saying I must work 8 and 8 and 8 and 8 or else. And even if it's blocks of time that you sign up for, that's not something that I'm interested in. I want to get on, drive as little or as much as I like, and as the day progresses, maybe I change my schedule around to compensate. Maybe something that I'm doing takes longer than I anticipate and I want to finish it before I go out. This often happens. I don't think this can really be overstated. The number one reason people like being a contractor, and the number one reason that people like being any part of the gig economy, is the fact that it's so flexible. So if you remove that flexibility, then you've just destroyed the gig economy. So if you're a cab driver, you're very much in favor of this. If you're an activist, maybe you don't know any better. If you're Uber corporate, this is maybe the worst thing you can do, because it's going to completely destroy your business model. But if I, as a driver, I have to wake up, and whether I'm tired or not, maybe I just haven't, maybe I'm not awake enough to drive. You want me to be out on the road when I'm tired, when ordinarily maybe I'll go back and nap for a couple of hours. Then I'll be out, I'm fresh, and I'm safe to drive. But instead, if you now tell me you must be out, otherwise it's going to count against you and potentially affect your employment. Again, this is not only a bad situation, it's outright dangerous in this case. It's bad enough under normal circumstances, but then if you now force a driver who is drowsy to be out or risk losing their job, that driver is going to be out. And if that driver is not operating at 100%, you now have a more dangerous driver who is out operating on your behalf, which is, bad for everyone. It's bad for the passengers, it's bad for the drivers. The only people it's not bad for is the cab drivers who want Ubers to crash and burn, to make people not want to ride with them. So again, scheduled blocks of time for Uber drivers is not what I consider to be a good situation, but it is a logical outcome if you consider the circumstances of a company that has to restrict the number of employees and make sure they have employees out at times when they need them out. It might also be the case that you don't get the blocks of time that you want, in which case your schedule gets completely fucked every single week. Talk to anyone who works in a hospital to see how much they enjoy that situation. Next, we have minimum wage, which is expected of those who are employed. Now, again, this will depend a lot on your individual circumstances, but let me just take myself in 2 different situations. If you had come to me 4 years ago during the bad old days, back when Uber was not that popular, the only people who used it were students, and all of the students were gone for summer, I picked the absolute worst possible time to start driving for Uber, but that's when I started. There were times when I would sit for 2 to 3 hours at the side of the road waiting for a ride without getting one, and you only get paid when you're driving a ride, so I was making $0 an hour. Now, if you had come to me back then and said, hey, do you want to be an employee and you get a guaranteed whatever the minimum wage is, like $8 an hour, I would have jumped on that, because it was a difference between 8 and 0. Now, some nights I would go out and I would make $40 all night long, and some nights I would go out and I would make $100 all night long. But it just really varied, and it depended, day of the week, time of night, that sort of thing. Some days were better than others. Some nights the bars were popping, some nights they weren't. And, there's huge variability. If you had come to me and said, you want to get paid by the hour, I might have said yes. If you were to ask me the same question now, the answer would probably be no, but there'd have to be a lot of deliberation there, because when it comes down to it, my total hourly pay is well above minimum wage. But that depends on a lot of things. Tips, not one of them. Tips don't matter at all, because no one here tips. But when it comes down to, let's say, promotions and quests and surges, these add up and make my hourly rate go pretty high. And sometimes my hourly rate is unbelievably high. But it just depends on the individual trips that I'm taking. And sometimes late at night, rarely nowadays, I might get a few minutes break between trips. But more often than not, the second I finish one trip, the next one is ready to go, and if I want, I can take it. As we're considering, though, there are always going to be some caveats. So if you said everything could stay exactly the same as it is right now, but if I don't make 15 an hour, I get paid 15 an hour, I'd be like, yeah, it sounds pretty good, because there's no downside. But as we've seen, nothing comes without a cost. So Uber, if you were to, again, consider the evil corporation's point of view, if they're going to guarantee a minimum wage, where's that money going to come from? It's going to either come from increasing the fares of passengers, which probably is not going to happen, or it's going to come from reducing pay somewhere else. So I expect, as a driver, that if I get a guaranteed minimum wage, other pay is going down. That means surges are going to be lower, promotions are going to be lower, the per mile rate is probably going to be lower, the time component of trips is probably going to be removed entirely. In short, I expect the bulk of pay at that point, if there is a minimum wage, is going to be just the minimum wage. That is, you're going to have your hourly rate just for being on the app, and everything else is going to cover your mileage, essentially. Now, as it is right now, that's going to result in a pay cut for me. But it's not an insurmountable difference. It does mean, however, that the way that you drive is going to be very different. So, as it is right now, I want to maximize my earnings, which means I'm taking promotions into account, I'm taking surges into account, I'm taking quests into account. Quests are probably the most important thing of all. But if I'm getting paid an hourly and none of that stuff matters, then that means the entire character of trips is going to change. So as it is now, I want to get to trips fast, I want to deliver them fast, obviously good service, but I want to make sure I'm at the busy places, I want to deliver them fast, and the more trips I do, the more I make, right? So contrast that with the minimum wage. For the minimum wage, you're getting paid for your time spent on the app. Surges, if they exist at all, are going to be lower. Promotions, if they exist at all, why would they exist? Because that doesn't make sense. So promotions are going away, quests are going away. Mileage is going to be reduced, probably to the federal rate. So basically just to cover your mileage at exactly the rate that you're driving. And your time rate is going to be removed because that's included in the minimum wage. So at this point, the amount of time spent on the app is the only thing that matters, which means, ironically enough, the best thing for an individual driver to do is to drive as few trips as possible. Put another way, if getting people to their destinations doesn't have any impact on the amount that you get paid, then you have no incentive to actually deliver them. So as a driver, if you are min-maxing your earnings, the best thing you can possibly do in this scenario, if there's a minimum wage, is to not drive people. In fact, after every single trip, the best thing to do would be to just take off driving into the countryside. And eventually you'll get a trip pinged to come back. At that point, you do a U-turn, you drive back into town, you're getting paid for the whole trip out, you're getting paid for the whole trip back, and then you pick someone up, you drop them off, and you head back out into the countryside. This helps absolutely no one. Yes, drivers are getting paid, but they're being paid to do essentially nothing. The passengers are pissed off because obviously they're not getting to their destinations in a timely manner. Uber is losing money because they make money off of volume, and the volume is decreased. The only people that benefit in this case are the cab drivers, because as people get more and more pissed off, they might decide to give cabs a shot once again. Minimum wage provides a reverse incentive to the very thing that you are supposed to be doing as a driver. Given a choice between the current situation where I'm rewarded for efficiency and for doing the thing that I'm supposed to be doing, and I'm compensated more for doing that than I would be if I were just paid a flat rate per hour, I would prefer the current situation. So minimum wage, yes, there might be some people where it would benefit them. Maybe if you're in a town, maybe you're in a small town and there's just not that many rides. You get paid to sit on your ass and look at your phone, watch YouTube videos or something. But if you're in a busy place and you're getting lots of rides, and if there are surges and promotions and quests, then minimum wage doesn't really help you. It might actively hurt you. The other thing, as I mentioned, is that since Uber drivers are in competition with each other, if there is one rider and two drivers, in the current situation, whoever gets the ride gets paid. In the minimum wage example, whoever takes the ride is a sucker, and the other one gets paid for doing nothing. So again, it's a reverse incentive to do the thing that you are being paid to do. So minimum wage, personally, I'm against it. Not because of minimum wage in principle, but just because of the implications for how it impacts driving. Next, we have health insurance, and for most of the activists, I think this is their number one issue. And also for the two people who were Uber drivers who were in favor of being employees, this was their number one issue. The idea behind it is sensible, which is that if you are an employee, you should receive, again, the benefits of being an employee, which includes health insurance. Again, as with anything else, we have to look at it from multiple perspectives. So, if we consider Uber as an evil corporation, which is trying to cut costs, do you think that Uber, the corporation, is going to find drivers the highest quality insurance possible and shell out the most amount of money for a gold level, low deductible, 90% coverage policy? Or do you think the company is going to find the cheapest policy possible and not give a damn about how that relates to anything that a driver might be able to get on their own? Now, I tend to think that the company is going to do just that, which is if they are forced to give employees health insurance, they're going to find the absolute worst health insurance they can possibly get, because doing so saves them money. So as a driver, if you are considering health insurance, you have to ask yourself, is the reduced pay worth the difference in the benefits that I'm getting? So put it another way, if Uber is giving me some health insurance policy and reducing my pay by X amount of dollars to do so, would I be willing to pay X amount of dollars myself for that same policy? So if you were presented with a fantastic policy, and it's actually better than one that you would have paid the same amount for, and actually you would have paid more for it yourself, and you're happy with the policy, then you would say, yes, you actually do want this benefit of being an employee. On the other hand, if you are less concerned with health insurance, or are not willing to pay as much as your paycheck was reduced, then this is actually a worse outcome for you. So again, this is one where you individually would have to decide if this is an outcome that you want. Now, for me personally, I do not have health insurance, and the amount that I would be willing to pay for health insurance is like $10 a month maximum. So if my paycheck is being cut by more than $10 a month, then I don't want it. And it is very likely that my paycheck is being cut by more than $10 a month, which means I don't want that policy, and I'd be happy to take my chances. There are those, especially activists, who would insist on people having health insurance, whether they are willing to pay for it or not, whether they want to pay for it or not, and to them I would say suck my nuts. But especially if you want to reduce my pay by more than the amount that I would be willing to pay, especially for a policy that's probably not as good as one that I would get if I were wanting to pick one out myself. Uber is going to get people the absolute worst health insurance it can find for the lowest amount it can possibly pay, just to meet the absolute minimum requirements, and doing so is probably going to cost the drivers more than if they were to simply get the policies themselves. Not only that, if you've ever worked for a company and all of a sudden they just decide, hey, your healthcare policy, by the way, you're used to that one, oh, here's this new one, you get this one now. They don't ask you, they don't consult your opinion, that's just whatever they decide to do. So again, if remember the whole you can keep your doctor, remember that. Well, you couldn't keep your doctor then, and you damn sure won't be able to keep your doctor now, if and when Uber decides to change your health insurance policy whenever they feel like it. And again, this comes down to you as an individual. Now, you might be in a situation where you personally find health insurance is like your number one issue. Maybe you have a spouse or child or something, and you really need that family benefit or something. And, it's understandable. But realize that as drivers are in competition with each other, just because it is better for you doesn't mean it's something that I'm willing to accept, and I'm sure the reverse is also true. So you as an individual will have to decide if health insurance is a make or break for you, and how that impacts whether you would benefit more from being an employee or not. Also keep in mind that if Uber decides to classify every single driver as part-time, then this is completely irrelevant anyway. Or in the best case, it only applies to those drivers who actually become employees in the first place. So assuming I become an employee because I drive a ridiculous number of hours, it's not something that I want. And whether you want it, frankly, doesn't matter to me because drivers are in competition with each other. And conceptually, even if this is better for you, you getting what you want is worse for me in this case, because the less drivers there are, the better the circumstances are for me, and vice versa. So again, this is a situation where drivers are in competition with each other. So secure your own bag, as the saying goes. But at least in this case, it's a bag I'm willing to do without, and I would rather secure other bags elsewhere as compensation. Next, we have paid leave, which is laughable, really, because this is just not a thing in the U.S. So let's ignore that. Let's just go to days off. Well, if you aren't an employee as you aren't an employee now, then this is irrelevant because you can take as little or as much time off at any time that you like. It's one of the main benefits of being an Uber driver. In contrast, if you become an employee, then this is going to be the only way you're going to be able to get out of your mandatory 40 hours a week. As it is right now, it's a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. So the same thing goes with paid maternity leave. If you're just talking about leave, that is time off from work, then this again is a solution to a problem that doesn't currently exist, because as it is right now, you can simply take off as much time as you like. Now, if you have your set 40 hours and whatnot, and you're required to be on the clock, but you want to take maternity leave, now that's something else, right? So now it's an opportunity for maybe a part-timer to come in and get some hours, but it doesn't really hurt anyone else, right? So you're simply requesting time off from your employer, which, it's fine. Doesn't hurt anything. On the other hand, if you're asking for paid maternity leave, now we got a problem because that payment has to come from somewhere. So is it coming from increased rates for passengers? Probably not. Is it coming from Uber cutting its own corporate expenditures? Probably not. Where's it going to come from? It's going to come from paying the drivers less. Okay, so you want me to take a pay cut so you can take time off with the kids? Yeah, that's a hard pass for me. Nope. Next, we have unemployment pay, which, again, is a solution to a problem that doesn't really exist right now. And as it is right now, there are a ton of would-be drivers sitting home and collecting checks to not drive. It's not an ideal solution by any means, but, it has ripple effects through the economy. But if we're going to require Uber to carry unemployment insurance on its drivers, that money is going to come from somewhere. Where is it going to come from? It's going to come from lower payments to the drivers. So it's hard enough to get me to care about people on actual unemployment, but when you want to collect checks at the expense of my paycheck, not just like indirectly through taxes, but like my actual paycheck, now we've got a real problem. So that's a super hard no pass for me. The last issue has to do with job security and protections, because employees do have protections against simply being laid off without cause. And unfortunately, this is a problem with Uber due to the nature of the work. If you have a passenger who is a Karen, they can request to speak to the manager, leave a 1-star, and try to get you cut from the service. And I've heard of instances where this happened to people I've driven around. I had someone try to do it to me. There's a guy didn't take through a Wendy's drive-thru at the busiest time of night, and he put in a complaint for reckless driving. So this is a sort of thing that unfortunately does happen. And maybe this is a situation that Uber can look into, but as it is right now, Uber drivers have zero job security. And it would be nice if there were some way to remedy that a little bit. The fact that they've started allowing for dash cam footage uploading and evidence has helped a lot, I think, in that regard. But, the protections for employees might be of some benefit there, but, on the other hand, it might also be abused. And it just kind of comes down to the individual circumstances. So I'm going to call this a wash. It's not great as it is, and it might be improved, but I think it's something that they could improve whether or not people are considered employees. Oh, of course, there's taxes as well. That was the entire part 1 video. And as I talked to people and I asked them their reasons for preferring to be a contractor, that was like the number 2 reason. Because the people who were concerned about their tax burden, they like the benefits of being a contractor. But as I explained to them that it ends up being a wash, they're usually pretty surprised by that. But, as we get to talking, it doesn't really change their opinion on whether they want to be a contractor or not. So all the different reasons I talked about, the expected results of what would happen if we were reclassified as employees, most people couldn't imagine a scenario where they have to do a 9 to 5 Uber driving as an example. that covers my perspective on it, and you can see where I'm coming from, and you can also see where you might fall depending on your individual circumstances. The important thing here is that it's not one size fits all, and at least in my situation, there's no question that being a contractor is better than being an employee. And for people I talk to, the same applies. But it might be that you live in a particular city or town and have circumstances such that being an employee would be better for you. And, I'm perfectly willing to acknowledge that, but it just depends on your priorities and where you fall on these various different issues and what you think the likely outcomes are going to be if this change takes place. I think, unfortunately, what's happening is all we're hearing from online, especially, and also in government, are the activists. And it makes sense, because if you're busy driving, what you're not doing is calling your congressman. It's been like, 2 months since I made a video, and it's just like I've hardly taken any time off, but I haven't really been engaging in the conversation. So all you hear are the people who are in favor of drivers being classified as employees for whatever various reasons, and some of them are better than others. But the idea that this is a one-size-fits-all is very misguided. Now, it might be the drivers in places like New York and San Francisco, maybe they would really benefit from being employees. At least where I am and people I've talked to and the circumstances here, I definitely don't think that would be a benefit here. Where I am, hardly anyone wants this. That includes the vast majority of other professional drivers. That includes drivers that I've driven around and been driven around by. But unfortunately, the changing policy is coming from the top down, from people who think they know better than the people actually doing the work. It does make sense, though, that the activists, who may or may not actually know what it's like to drive for Uber, they simply care about their advocacy. The cab drivers are pushing for anything that will hurt Uber and its drivers, and that includes making Uber drivers employees, because that would devastate the Uber and gig economy. And Uber corporate, of course, is pushing against it. Passengers don't care as long as they get cheap rides. And Uber drivers, for the most part, are blissfully ignorant of anything that's going on as they go about their business. And they'll be hit with a rude awakening one day when they realize that the entire business model has changed. But until then, I guess get while the getting is good and continue stacking your Benjamins. I'm going to make one more video, which I want to talk about the current state of Uber and why things are the way they are. I've been slowly piecing things together, and there have been some news articles lately that have really shed some light on things. But I think that with the changes that Uber has made to its back end since December, and you as a driver, if you're a driver, you've probably noticed these changes. The passengers have noticed the changes. Everyone has noticed the changes. But the way that you drive can be optimized to account for it. And that will benefit both you and other drivers in ways that I'll discuss in the next video. But anyway, thanks for watching and have a good one.